At first, this question was a little controversial. We didn't think it was that good. And then we started chatting about it a little bit, realized there was a lot to talk about. And we try to get away from being serious all the time, right? So, here it is. Number one from All Day Mark. Baby boomers don't seem to be offended by being labeled as such. Why do millennials seem to be so offended by being labeled millennial? And Piano Man, I'll let you go first.
All right, on the spot here. I don't really have a good answer because I think it's. Wait, you might have to repeat the question, but I think part of the question is saying that baby boomers aren't offended by the phrase baby boomer, right? But millennials
Or
get
being
offended being
called a
called millennial.
boomer.
Yeah. I feel
Yeah.
like they do get offended being called a boomer because I've been around people when their kids or grandkids say, okay, boomer to them, and they roll their eyes as if that's just not true. Like it's just a stigma, which is, I think, the exact reason why millennials don't like being called millennials because it's like a negative connotation towards it. Like there's never really, in general, a negative connotation toward being called a baby boomer until very recently when they say okay boomer as in
But do
like
you think that's why that makes them mad because they're kind of proud of being a boomer, so now Zoomers have turned it into a negative phrase?
yeah, I mean, they've turned it into a negative phrase because they do things that people don't like. But also, so millennials have brought upon themselves a negative connotation because a lot of them like feel like they're entitled to everything, and that's really where the negative connotation I think comes from millennials. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong. But then you think about baby boomers, and didn't they kind of have everything handed to them as well? But I guess we could somebody else could take over here.
Sons and daughters of the war. JBM?
Yeah, I agree in the sense that boomers definitely have been big mad, as the kids say, at people saying "Okay, boomer." But I also think there is really a deeper layer to this question because there are things like there are reasons that are justified why people get upset about this, right? But like I think it's crazy the way boomers treat millennials because they treat millennials like, oh man, like you're how old and you're not married and you don't have kids, you don't own a house yet, like just completely ignoring the fact and not understanding like what has happened in terms of inflation and how much stuff costs versus how much people are making, and it is very funny to me. Doesn't mean you can't make it as a millennial. It's just a little tougher on that end of the spectrum. Granted, I'm sure there's plenty of things the boomers had tough too, but it does drive me crazy when I see boomers act the way they did it and pull themselves up from their own bootstraps, which may or may not be true, according to Piano Man.
Well, my thought on this was I don't necessarily know if boomers do get offended as much at OK Boomer. What I see is, Gen Z says that phrase to like Generation Xers, like my father who asked this question is the first year of like Gen X, right? So what I see is people saying, "Oh, okay, boomer," and they're like, "I'm not a boomer." You know what I mean? It's like people who are in between that, and no one seems to be mad about being Generation X. I would say of all the generations that are around right now, Gen X are probably the ones that are. I don't know if they're proud, like I'm proud to be a Gen X, but there's no negative connotation, and I think that's where it gets kind of muddy is I don't know if boomers really care. I think they like we're again the sons of daughters of the war. We're the greatest generation or whatever they call it. And I think it's Generation X that gets mad when they call them a boomer because it's like, oh no, that's my parents, right? You don't want to be compared to your parents. But I also think millennials just kind of, I don't know, we put it on ourselves, right? Like there's the stigma
Are we
that
millennials? Yeah.
no, yeah, we are.
All right.
Mil-
Oh, we're the high
Millennials,
end.
what, 85 to
Oh,
2000 or
for
something.
real?
Mhm. Yeah,
85?
I believe it's every 20 years, right? It's like 45 to 65, 65 to 85, 85 to 05. I think something like that. I
Nice.
mean, there's different discrepancies on when
Actually,
it
yeah.
starts.
I just looked it up on Wikipedia. It says 81 to 96 are millennials,
Really, I think, like I
which
said, I
is
think there's
insane to me.
discrepancies,
So,
but we did bring it on ourselves, right?
JBM, you're muted if you're talking.
Unmute. But yeah, so that's my thing. I don't know if boomers really care as much as Gen X just get so mad. But one thing I wanted to bring up that JBM brought up is boomer, whatever. Karen, that's what they get mad about, right?
Who is they? Isn't that mostly millennials?
Just people like hate getting called a Karen. And
That's 'cause
Karen
anything-
is a very common Gen X name. You see what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I think it's the same as my first answer is anything that has a negative connotation to it, you're not going to be like you're not going to like being called it. Just like baby boomer never had a negative connotation for the last however long I've been alive that I know of. Millennials had a negative connotation for the last 10 years. Karens have not had a negative connotation until the last 2 years, 3 years, or maybe 1 year. I don't know when this Karen thing started. But now you're not going to be like being, okay, I can't say this phrase for the second time. You're not going to like being called a Karen because it implies that you are a Karen.
Getting the manager.
That's a good point.
I mean, do you guys get offended by being called millennials or like, you know?
I'm only called it if I do something bad. So, of course, I wouldn't like it at that point.
That's valid.
If I do something good, nobody's gonna be like, you millennial, you hardworking millennial.
You
such a great
millennial
job."
and your Tesla. That's
good
funny.
point.
All right. Yeah. I mean, good points. I think the real question is where does Gen X fall on this, right? I mean, why doesn't nobody talk about them?
They will when they get old too.
Maybe it's just that the Gen Z are just outwitting all of us, right?
Gen Z are the wittiest, I think, but they're also the
I-
youngest. Doesn't the youngest always come up with
guess
the new trends?
Culture trench.
Yep.
And that's the T. All right. Anything else on this? We good?
Nah.
Nah.
All right.
boomer.